Muhammad Eissa is a dear friend of ours and the university who has helped us and opened our eyes and saved our bacon. I always have to work bacon jokes in with Muhammad because of an experience we had with trying to get a baconless pizza at Brick Oven. Anyway, Muhammad is a scholar of absolute wonderful background and insight. He began his education, his higher education at the Al-Azhar, the Islamic BYU, and came to the United States and did a second PhD at UCLA. Mazboot. And has moved on to take positions at Northwestern and the University of Michigan, visiting professor here, and he is just a wonderful bridge person and someone who appreciates people and takes them and their faith very seriously. And so we welcome him and Professor Toronto, who also is a wonderful bridge person. And but many of you know Professor Toronto better, and so I won't take any more time here, and I'll turn time over to them. Thank you very much.
Dr. Eissa and I are going to share the time today. I'm going to take just a few minutes at the beginning to kind of introduce the topic and set the stage a little bit, and then Dr. Eissa will pick up from there. Most of what you're going to be hearing today results from some collaborative effort that we have had together in studying textbooks in the Islamic Middle East primarily. We were part of an international team that included Muslims and non-Muslims who recently looked at the content of religious education textbooks in 10 different Middle Eastern countries, and then had a conference at Brown University last November where we got together to discuss the findings and the implications. It was a fascinating kind of an exercise. And so we'll be presenting some of the scholarly discourse on that particular topic and some of the findings, and I think you'll find it interesting and revealing as well. Among the challenges facing Muslims at the dawn of the 21st century is the need for a coherent vision of Islam's place in modern society and a unified voice to articulate that vision persuasively. The issue of how to reconcile traditional religious values, teachings, and practices of Islam with the requirements of an international socio-economic order based on concepts of secularism, pluralism, and democracy is the focus of intense debate within the Muslim community. One Muslim scholar, Fazlur Rahman, framed the question this way: the heart of the problem with a Muslim, which a Muslim must face and resolve if he wishes to reconstruct an Islamic future on an Islamic past, is this: how shall this past guide him, and which elements of his history may he modify, emphasize, or deflate? It lies in the actual positive formulation of Islam, of exactly spelling out what Islam has to say to the modern individual and society. However, with numerous sects, ideologies, legal codes, schools of Islamic law, and political systems across the Islamic world, and with no universally accepted authority to define issues, render binding interpretations, and rally support, the Islamic world faces internal conflict in its effort to arrive at acceptable, distinctive, and viable Islamic solutions to problems such as poverty, disease, hunger, unemployment, illiteracy, and national governance. This ideological conflict is played out in most Muslim countries between political elites and Islamist elements in society who vie for authority to control the national agenda by claiming to be the sole and rightful arbiters of Islamic orthodoxy. Political power in these countries depends on religious legitimacy, and thus the issue of what Muslims in Egypt anyway call al-khitab ad-dini, religious discourse, how religion is interpreted, communicated, and perceived, lies at the heart of the struggle to determine the nation's identity and direction. I think it's important to realize that In most Islamic countries, the educational system is very, very centralized. It's controlled by the government. The curriculum is designed by writers who really do answer to the government. In this case, in Egypt, that we looked at specifically, Al-Azhar, which is Dr. Eissa's alma mater, has a controlling hand in the curriculum of these particular countries, and therefore it's really used to reflect what the government would like young people to know. In general, I would say that school books do provide a window, a unique opportunity for understanding a country's ideals, challenges, and inner dynamics. An analysis of these textbooks can yield significant insights about processes of nation building, identity construction, and social change. What Muhammad and I were trying to do in our study, and what we'll try to do in this presentation today, is to shed light on the constructs of political and religious identity formation in Islamic schools by analyzing the contents of Islamic education curricula for grades, basically elementary and secondary grades in a number of countries that Muhammad will talk about. Our study and the study of the other scholars indicates that the curriculum of religious education in Islamic countries plays a vital role in the government's efforts to achieve national goals of political stability, economic development, and social harmony. I won't say more than that except to maybe point out that just today in reading the New York Times there was an interesting example of how important schools are, religious curriculum, in shaping identity in any community, but particularly in Islam, and how it really affects the choices we make, the interests that we might have, our interaction with other people. The particular example I'm thinking of is in Rwanda. There was an article today about how tens of thousands of Rwandans who were formerly Roman Catholic in the years since the Civil War, it's been about 9 years now, that tens of thousands of them are becoming Muslims. And when they were asked why they were becoming Muslims, they said, well, it was the Muslim community who protected us, as the Hutus were massacring the Tutsis and vice versa. When Tutsi Muslims took refuge in Muslim communities that were Hutu, the Hutus refused to massacre them. And what they said was our Muslim identity was stronger than our ethnic or national identity. And so our sense of being connected with our Tutsi brothers and sisters would not allow us to massacre them, even though that's what other tribes people wanted us to do. So that idea of an Islamic identity that's often formed within the religious curricula of schools is a powerful force in nation building and affects many, many issues that are of interest to people around the world. So I'll turn the time now to Dr. Eissa to touch on some of these issues more.
Thank you very much, and I'm really happy and glad to be here repeatedly to talk about different things. And I got the best of luck when Dr. Tranto asked me to share with him writing this paper. I was not initially invited to participate in that conference, but Dr. Tranto was kind enough to ask me to share with him that opportunity, which was a very revealing opportunity for me to look into textbooks teaching religion, Islam in particular. We focused on Egypt in our research. However, in the conference, we were exposed to other papers from discussing textbooks from other Muslim countries, which I found very interesting to discuss here under this title of One Islam and Multiple Interpretation. And this is not a new concept at all, because every ideology is exposed to have multiple interpretation by people to suit their needs and expectations and goals. And with Islam in particular, as one religion, people immediately after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, Muslims depended on the Prophet to interpret everything that he said to them was revealed to him. So he was available to answer all questions. After his death, the revelation has ceased to come to anybody else, and people started to have their own interpretation. So the concept of multiple interpretation starts as early as the prophetic period itself. However, with the multitude of nations embracing Islam as a religion, with also the political division and multitude of political entities taking Islam as a religion and molding this teaching of Islam to suit their own national and economic social agendas, we found that Islam has been interpreted differently according not only horizontally, geographically, but also vertically in the same nation over periods of time. The curriculum changes according to reflect the needs and goals and ambitions and whatever the government or the ruling regime that has the central hand on deciding what kind of education to be imparted on children of that country. The question of what Islam and whose Islam has been raised even recently, as 4 years ago, by Professor Brad Cook, who is a former BYU professor in School of Education. He raised it in some of his papers, and he raised the question. He focused also in Egypt. But I thought it might be interesting for us to review some other countries. We see what Islam really served the goals of those countries. I will start with Turkey, because Turkey strikes us as a very different example from other countries, from Egypt or Jordan or Syria. The main focus of the curriculum in Turkey was dealing with the issues of secularism and Islam. And the identity of Turkey, of course, started to be changed immediately after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in 1924, when Turkey was announced or was declared to be a secular country. That was a very big change after Turkey has been the seat of the Ottoman Empire, with the Caliph who ruled the Muslim world just collapsed immediately. Then that's a very, very sharp change from what the situation was before and what the situation is now. But what kind of role that Islam plays in a secular country like Turkey, for example? The books in Turkey sometimes even overemphasize nationalism over the tradition or the worships or acts of worship in Islam itself. So they emphasize solidarity, militarism, and more than the pillars of Islam itself. The text included an attempt to layers of process of socialization and functionalizes Islam, to make Islam functional, not necessarily from a religious spiritual point of view or from aspects of a religious spiritual, as many people would take a religion to be functional in a spiritual religious mode. They functionalize it as health, environment, power, observing time. For example, the prayer is functionalized to be a training to observe time and to be systematically organized. That's how Turkey perceived rituals and Islam in their modern dealing with it. In 1928, the official recognition of Islam as the state religion, that was after 4 years after the Turkey became a secular country. They recognized Islam as the official religion. It took them 4 years to just bring back Islam. At the beginning, they did not want to bring back Islam or to talk even about Islam in 1924. But in 1928, they brought Islam to the picture. But how to deal with Islam as the religion of the state? However, they recognize Islam, but take the implementation device, they took away from Islam the implementation of Islamic rituals, of Islamic law. For example, the result was the abolition of Islamic family law and the courts that dealt with Islamic family law. Secularization embodied that. To be a secular state, you have to do away with any religious ruling, even in family laws, but this is maintained in other countries, like in Egypt, for example. Still Islamic family law is enforced. But in Turkey, it was abolished. An attempt to define the national identity in a Western term. Turkey in 1980, there was an interesting change in the attitude toward Islam and toward religion. This was mandated by the situation that Turkey had to face from communism. and the threat from socialist ideas brought Islam to the surface, to the up to the front in Turkey, and they used Islam to identify Turkey as Turkish Islamic synthesis that identified what a Turkey is and what Turkish person, what Turkish children should be proud of what. The Islamic education was in schools, was implemented in the schools, but it was elective. By the 1980, they made it compulsory and universal. All students in school should be taking Islamic classes, and that was regardless of what religion they have. That was seen as a part of national identity, exactly like secularism. Turkey considers secularism as described something that Islam promotes. They created that synthesis between secularism and Islam, and they portrayed Islam as promoting secularism. And they cited many aspects of Islamic economic and Islamic social teachings to promote secularism. Things like how they defined, they protected. The most important aspect for them was secularism, to promote and push secularism. But as an Islamic country, they always reconciled the issues of secularism with religious issues from Islam. The absence of Middle Eastern context in Turkish Islamic studies is a phenomenon that we see in other countries as well, because they are very consumed in their own agendas. They promote only very national agenda, especially with Turkey. They promoted the national identity, militant identity, military, and the love of Turkey. They even promoted so many national issues that they considered that Islam without Turkey would have been disintegrated if it was left only in the hands of the Arabs. And they promote the personality of Ataturk in the Islamic textbooks, is promoting Kemal Ataturk and showing him in competition with the Prophet Muhammad himself for the frequent appearances and frequent talk about Kemal Ataturk. In contrast with this particular picture with Turkey, we move to Saudi Arabia, for example. I'm just going to skim through these quickly so we can have time to answer some questions. Saudis were observed by so many analysts as the most, what to say, I don't want to say something harmful, but at least the most identified Islamic teaching according to a particular agenda that the Saudis have. They added to Islamic sources the Quran and Hadith, the teachings of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. Considering that Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab himself was a reformer in his own time, but his ideas were taken out of context, out of time, and added to by the Saudi regime to legitimize and justify and impart all kinds of ideologies that the Saudis wanted to promote, and taught these ideas to school children. Teaching Islam and teaching religion education in Saudi Arabia used a small textbook, a small book that Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab wrote, Kitab al-Tawheed, and created a curriculum for 12-year school academic years for children to study. And the time these children studied Islam was tremendously. Saudi ranks the first among Muslim countries in terms of time allocated to religious studies. So Saudis use Quran, Hadith, and the teachings of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab and the ideologies that Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab promoted, and the conservative attitude towards Islam and society to promote the national agenda, the identity of a Saudi. It was perceived in a very negative light by many others who looked at Saudi curriculum, even by many Muslims who happen to work in Saudi Arabia or to be exposed to the ideology that the Saudis portrayed as Islamic ideology. They talked about issues concerning Tawheed itself, worshiping one God. What would this imply? You identify you as a Muslim, as a monotheist, believe in one God, but you believe in one God that's identified as the Muslim one God with all the definitions of that accompany worshiping the one God, which means putting some status for the Muslim over others, over other Muslims even, because this Muslim who follows the traditions according to Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, according to the Wahhabi guidelines, would be much better in the eyes of God than any other Muslim, let alone people who are not Muslims. So ideas of tolerance and coexistence and harmony among Muslims, let alone, of course, they don't talk at all about Shi'is. Although Saudi Arabia has about 10% of its inhabitants are Shi'is, of its citizens, but no mention at all of Shi'is. And the curriculum for the Saudis is very harshly criticized and still being criticized, and the hope for correcting this curriculum or writing different curriculum are far from being realized in a very short time. Because also the mentality of people who are in charge now just is a mentality created by the curriculum they studied before. It's very difficult to really implement new ideas or create new ideas or force new ideas unless it's coming from outside, and it is actually happening coming from outside. The review of the Saudi curriculum was done in two papers here. One focused on only the Kitab al-Tawheed, or the book that Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab wrote, and the other focused on the actual practice of schools and how the minds were formulated by those people who studied this Islam according to Saudi agenda. I will just very quickly highlight also that Islam for the Saudis stands alone has to be preached out, the Wahhabi ideas the ideas should be adopted by all Muslims. And there is a message and a mission among the Saudis that they have to do that. And they have to ignore completely the Shia, Khawarij, Karmatis, Zanj, Ismailis, any other sect, Islamic sect that existed in history that's not to be considered as Muslims at all. In some extent, they call them kafir, and the word kafir is used very freely. It's a, let's say, word used to apply to Muslims who don't follow the Wahhabis as well as other non-Muslims. And for the kafir, the punishment in the hereafter and the punishment is to be expected in the eyes of the Saudis. I don't know how many paradise will have very few people. So, in contrast with that, Iranian curriculum and prediction and implementation of Islamic teachings in schools, of course, focuses on Shiism. So Shiism is the main focus of the Iranian curriculum, and Shiism here, according to the Iranians, the Ismaili, the 12ers. And the school curriculum in Iranian schools, Iran, by the way, ranks number 5 in terms of time allocated to religious studies. It follows, in this case, here I see, Saudis, I say, ranked number 1, and you have the Yemen number 2, Qatar number 3, Libya number 4, Iran number 5. Iran has how much percentage? Like the Saudis have 31% of time allocated to religious studies. Yemenis have 28%. But Iran has 13.9% of time allocated to religious studies. The contrast with the Wahhabi, Iran uses religion education to strengthen the spiritual beliefs of the school children through explanation of Islam and Shiism on the basis of reason and Quran. But in addition to Quran, Hadith, the tradition, the prophetic tradition, and the tradition of the Imams and the Imamates. And the Imams are, of course, Imam Ali is the first, and then Fatima Zahra, then the 12 Imams. All the teachings of those are the corpus that represent the curriculum, the source of Islam for a Shia student. The objectives, of course, is to promote political insight based on those principles and the principles of Wilayat al-Faqih. And Wilayat al-Faqih here is a term used after the revolution of Khomeini revolution when Iran became an Islamic entity, Islamic country, representing how a country can be ruled by Islam according to Islamic Sharia and according to the interpretation of Islam in the Shi'i form of interpretation. And Wilayat al-Faqih means religio-political rule. The faqih or the alim would be the source of legislation in Iranian context. The goals of Iran emphasize two main things, jihad and shahada. The jihad is, could be, of course, as holy war, and shahada is the martyrdom. We should remember also that this ideology were formulated during the time of the Iran-Iraq war, which lasted between 1980 to 1988 for 8 years. So the jihad and shahada were very important concepts that the Shi'i schools have to implement very effectively in the schools through religious education. The emphasis, of course, was generated or based on those from the war with Iraq was behind the reason for that. And they're propagating the culture of jihad that a Shi'i, an Iranian in particular, has always to consider jihad as the loftiest goal to put in his mind or her mind. And they recruited children at the age of 15, 16, 17 during that war, as many of you know. But at the same time, Shi'i and Iranian curriculum talks about Islam as a religion of kindness, compassion, peace. It teaches us, as Iranians, to be honest, truthful, loyal, and kind to others. Islam is the religion of peace, tranquility, reflection, reason, and logic. That's part of the curriculum, as the Iranians put it. However, they distinguish between two types of Islam. They say there is the pure type of Islam, which is Islam of the Prophet Muhammad, and the American Islam. And the pure type of Islam is the Islam of the poor, Islam of the humble, Islam of the weak, Islam of the people who are down to earth. While Islam of the American Islam, or Islam of America, is the Islam of the arrogant, the devil, the shaitan, and the Islam of the wealthy, the oppressor, and that the kind of Islam that should be rejected. But the Islam of the poor and humble and kindness, that is the Islam that should be accepted. They, of course, drive their reasoning and drive their sources from the same principles that other countries drive, from the Quran and Sunnah and so on. They use the same expression, the same verses of Quran, talk about what is known in Islam as thawabit and mutaghayyirat. Thawabit, like the fixed mainstay Islamic teachings, which are the rituals, the prayer, the fasting, the almsgiving, the hajj. They keep these in concert with many other Sunni Muslims. And they also, different than the Sunnis, they recognize the Sunnis very well, and they never mention anything negative about the Sunnis, and they refer to them as the people who pray like us, who fast like us, who go to Hajj like us, who pray to the same direction as we pray, and they do, but we distinguish ourselves from them. We have the imamate. The imamate is a very important doctrine in the Shi'i madhab. The Sunnis don't believe in that. However, we share with them. We share with them also the agony and the pain and the oppression that Muslims share under towards or from the colonizers, from the imperialists, and from the West in general. They started with the British, of course, and Americans afterwards. The other example I'm going to mention here, so we talked about the Turks, Saudis, Iranians. They have different agendas, different national agendas. They aspire to identify themselves, to create an identity, to construct an identity for citizens in their countries. So they emphasize what is important and to be focused on those countries. We find a country like Oman, for example, which the population is almost 0.5% Ibadi, which is Khawarij, which is the Kharijite. And the 45% are Sunnis, and 3 to 5% are Shias. In a country like that, where the national agenda cannot really take one direction to be Sunni or one direction to be Ibadi, Khariji, and the Ibadite or Kharijite are different than both Sunnis and Shi'is in different ways, in many ways, especially with the system of government, because they believe, the Sunnis believe, if there is a Khalifa, the Khalifa should be from Quraysh, and the Ibadis and Khawarij were kind of the revolutionary, the rebellions among Muslims. They are based, their philosophy is based on a very indigenous Bedouin philosophy, that freedom, equality, and they just went out and established themselves as to be different from, although they are very harsh when it comes to worships and with regard to sinful acts, and they are very, very harsh. So the Omanis crafted a curriculum that is really avoiding all these things. It doesn't push any of the agendas of the Shi'is or Sunnis or Khawarij. What they emphasized in their curriculum, education, what they call generic Islam. And generic Islam, they avoid explicit sectarian display. So they stressed what? Personal piety, and stressed all the ethical and moral behavior of a Muslim, in a very general term. So that is the population of people who could really not afford to push one agenda over the other, otherwise it will create a havoc in the country. The Kharijite did not push their agenda. The Sunnis did not push their agenda. It created a very harmonious. But also Oman is not a country that's politically very ambitious or want to do anything that renders the world a revolutionary world. They just want to live in peace. And that's why it was very suitable for them to avoid any sectarian identity and push agenda of peaceful. And that's a place where I think paradise would be in their place sometime in the future. So Egypt, we come to Egypt now. Egypt with a state with a national agenda that varies from time to time. I wonder what the religion education was before the revolution, and then after the revolution during Nasser time, for example, when Nasser was pushing the leadership of Egypt in 3 different dimensions, as Islamic in particular. He saw Egypt, Nasser, from 52 to 1970, he saw himself as the leader of the Muslim world, in addition to Arab world and African world. And he didn't add Asia, because Egypt had just a little bit of Asia, not much. But he could have declared himself the leader of the world at that time, and nobody would have said anything. But however, Islamic curriculum has changed in Egypt. Even over a period of time after the revolution, it keeps changing. It's perpetually changing to reflect the national agenda. What Egypt suffers from now, socially, economically, politically, are the issues that are really reflected in the curriculum. In particular, when we studied the curriculum in Egypt, we saw lip service paid very much to human rights, for example, talking about all kinds of wonderful things that Islam teaches us regarding human rights: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and respect to others, respect to women, and rights of every creature, and all these wonderful kind of wonderful things that are drafted in United Nations human rights. But that's what the government wants to impart on the children in schools. because that reflects what the government wants to say. The political stability, for example, was one issue that government has to really deal with, because at the time that Egypt was in teaching these books, the stability in society is very shaky and still very shaky. So the teachings implemented this political stability as an Islamic teaching, and we have to abide by that and leave the government to do its job, and don't act as a what do you call, when you take the right in your own hands? What's the word used for that? Vigilante, yes, yeah. So because the Islamic movement and Islamic militant groups were really taking a toll on Egyptian government, so stability, political stability, was emphasized in Egyptian curriculum. Culture and dignity, or cultural identity of Egypt, is very highly emphasized in these books. You read the books, you think that Islam is only Egyptian. You think that Islam has only been revealed and crafted to suit Egyptian people. Either they don't say that directly, of course, they say Islam, that we belong to a big Muslim ummah, Muslim nation, but at the same time, all examples used to do anything, for example, I cited from the environment. You do good things, preserve the environment, because the Nile is the most wonderful thing that we have. We have to really keep it clean and preserve it and so on. We love our country because our country has this wonderful historical past and these wonderful monuments that we can visit, and we are learned in its schools. We have to really be loyal to our country. So issue of loyalty was very important to be emphasized in Egyptian schools. The family, the sanctity of family and gender identity is highly emphasized in these books. It reflects the very modern attitude. It is a walk away from the previous books, which were seen as very conservative, kind of not militant exactly, but at least encouraging the traditional way that Islam was always interpreted. But the modern books talk about modern problems, talk about problems of smoking, drugs, talking about problems of the influence of the West. They did not identify a particular country, but they talk about modesty, and Islam promotes modesty, but we are victimized by the media that really bombarding us with all the bad things that our children should not be imitating. So this comes very clear in the religious books, so to take these principles and emphasize them on behalf of the religion. I would like to stop here because I see that Jordan and Palestinian curriculum, in fact, is a very, very, very interesting curriculum, because before 1967, Palestinian curriculum of religious education was the Egyptian one. So it created the same kind of mentality and relation to religion, because especially Gaza was under the Egyptian protectorate from 1948 to, I think, to 76. But after 67, after 67 war, when Israel occupied the West Bank and Gaza, and the curriculum underwent, especially after Oslo Agreement, especially after creating a Palestinian authority. The authority commissioned a committee to study putting curriculum for all subjects, including religion education. And religion education is has to be balanced between accommodating the situation as it is and revolting against it as well. That was to strike a balance like that required some very clever minds to work with it. I'm not going to dwell on that now, but I would just want to leave some time for questions and answer, and thank you very much for your listening, and hope to have some questions to raise some issues. Stay there. Islamic Open University. I don't know. Yeah, Islamic Open University. I don't know much about the curriculum really, but we are talking about the curriculum in schools, grade schools, from first grade to 12th grade. But in universities, of course, as you know, in any university, the curriculum can be subject to whoever is teaching it. You design your own curriculum. If these universities, but some of these universities have their own agendas, like, for example, promoting the principles and ideals of Al-Ikhwan al-Muslimun, and this in particular, I'm aware of that. And I expect that the religion curriculum would be furthering the principle that Ikhwan Muslimun were always promoting.
Did you research how much the students were aware of the biases and emphases of the particular ideas you pointed out here?
We worked only in Egypt, but these are, I just thought of comparing other papers presented to the conference and how could Islam be interpreted in so many different ways. But we measured the students in a very, very unscientific measurement we did in Egypt. We took a trip to Egypt for a week, which was not enough, just interviewed some teachers and some students, and the results is very interesting. It's not like Saudis at all, because Saudis have observers to sit in schools to make sure that the classes are taught and students are indoctrinated, and the exams are directed towards testing them in what they studied. In Egypt, in fact, religion is not part of the GPE of the students, and only 2 hours a week or 3 hours a week, and it is not a subject that students look at with respect, not even look at the teacher with respect. Teachers are unhappy for different agendas, but it's very interesting to contrast the actual text that's written to reflect the ideas that the government want to impart on the students, and the real application if these ideas were really imparted, were really said to students the way it is. That would open the door also for something very dangerous, that people or the populace get their education in religion from private tutors, from mosques, from organizations, voluntary education, who have agendas that's different and not necessarily equivalent or parallel to the government agenda. And that's a very dangerous situation.
Do you feel that there is an existing educational textbook that could be a model for every other country in the Middle East?
The one I'm going to write. I don't think so. Maybe the direction now, or the tendency, is to create textbooks addressing ethics and talk about ethics, philosophical, religious ethics, which could be really the main underlining or the main common denominator for all religions, not only Islam. But this is being kind of opposed by many entities who want push for more religious agenda than others. Yes.
I have a couple of questions, actually more than a couple.
To Jim.
About how many hours a week do they spend? What's the range of hours per week in elementary school? And then, do you have an idea of what is done in secondary school as well? Or do they follow up with this curriculum, and how many hours?
It varies different from country to country. In most countries, it's 2 to 3 hours, except in those countries like the Yemen, the 5 first countries I mentioned, like in Iran. Saudi Arabia tops them all. 31% of the time, school time, is spent in religion. And religion here also is not one thing that you teach as religion textbook. The Islamic teachings are reflected on history books, reading books, and the religion is divided into some Quranic studies, hadith studies, interpretation studies, tajweed studies. This is what Saudis have. That's why they consume the 31% of time teaching Islam from many different angles. This is exactly the same curriculum that I studied in Al-Azhar, for example, which is a religious education school, that we know that before we go. But when you go to a public school and you find yourself spending 31% of your time taking all these subjects related to Islam, this is the top but a different, but in Tunisia, in Turkey, in Egypt, in Syria, and they are 2 or 3 hours a week from primary schools, middle schools, and high schools is the same.
Okay. You anticipated my next question, which is essentially, do they present religion to them as a conclusion, as a given conclusion? This is what Islam says.
Yes.
Or do they begin to teach them the methods for reading the text and for working out the problems themselves?
What they claim, you know, say something like that? Yes. No, there is a claim, of course, in some textbooks that they want to enable students to think for themselves, but to think the way we tell them to think. That's made clear. But think the way we tell you to think. But religion education in general, even in Al-Azhar, has not gone beyond the rote memorization, and this is what religion says. There is no chance really to teach them within a religious context to be analytical and reflective.
I'll just add that about 15 years ago, I looked at school textbooks, Islamic education textbooks in Egypt. And it was fascinating to go back as we were doing this project, looking at the curriculum from 2002, 2003, which are the most recent books, and compare them to the tone and some of the themes that were found 15 years ago. And one of the things that I noticed was that now, because of the intensification of the conflict between Islamists, between militants, and the government, which is played out in the schools as well, this power struggle that's going on for the hearts and minds of the people, that there's a much, much greater emphasis in the current textbooks about the role of religious authorities. It talks about who can you go to know what Islam says about something. There's not discussion about, well, you go to the Quran or you go to the Hadith and you kind of come up with your own ideas. It's you go to the ulama of Al-Azhar University or to the ulama in general, and it talks about how good and kind and wise and expert they are. You can't just go to anybody, and it goes back to this informal hidden curriculum is what they refer to it sometimes as. There's what's in the books, and there's what you get from the teacher who may not like what's in the book, or what you get in the tapes or in the youth organization you belong to. And so there's this constant tension between the informal and the formal, between the Islamist and the official government, and the textbooks constantly put forward the idea that the true arbiters, the ones who really know, are the ulama. Those are the ones that you turn to for your view of what true Islam says. So it's normative and it's authoritative in that sense. And I would ask the same question about BYU, since we made the comparison of the Islamic BYU. To what extent do we promote questioning and that sort of thing in our religion classes? And I'm a former religion teacher too, so.
I have a question. I'm from Germany, and I know that there is, for example, in Bonn, a very large mosque and school that was totally funded by the Saudi government. However, the people who send their children there are all immigrants and therefore come from many different countries. So does the financial sponsor decide what is taught there, or do the parents decide by what Islamic sect is represented in that mosque, or how does the curriculum get decided?
Simply, if the parents were able to fund their own school, they would have not be in need to Saudi's money. But Saudi's money is part of the criticism that's being directed to Saudis in general, not only in Germany, all over Europe and the United States, Africa, and Asia. They were promoting the Islamic, the way they think, but that's what we call, this is for them is the one Islam that everybody has to know, because this is the true Islam. And when they send Islam, they consider the cultural traditions of other Muslims, especially the Turks. The Turks can be in the eyes of other Muslims as the most remote people from Islam because of some traditions they follow, some habits and so on. But genuinely, originally, authentically, generically, they are preserving Islam, and they follow the same basic teachings of Islam. But in the eyes of the Saudis, there's so much heresy in their Islam, in their practice of Islam. That's why we want to really take care of them and want to have them with us in paradise. And we have to send them some money so they can be with us and we enjoy their company. That's
Could you touch upon Sufi teachings and Sufis? I've seen a lot of books translated and writings and poetry and so on and so forth in the West.
no.
And whereas back then in Jordan, Palestine, and so on, I hardly ever heard anything about.
Unfortunately, we are talking about the textbooks, and the textbooks do not refer to anything, do not refer to Sufis, especially Egyptian textbooks who have, Egypt has a great big number of Sufis, tariqas, but textbooks never refer to that. This takes someone to study Islam in a collective way, in an university setting or outside textbooks. But the textbooks do not touch upon that at all.
Are they frowned upon?
In many countries, yes, they are frowned upon because some Sufi sects really are very kind of out of the way. They some of them look wacky enough for people to really don't want to be one of these. But some, the genuine, original Sufis are very, very, very dedicated, devout Muslims. And those are the ones who really you cannot distinguish them. The wacky ones are the ones who are making the noise outside. That's why nobody wants really to identify with them. Kirk, you had something.
Well, I was just going to wonder to what degree there's been a lot of criticism of the way of anti-Israeli sentiment in textbooks, and I wonder if what your read was of the Egyptian textbooks and how they deal with Israel.
Jim started that when he wrote his papers 15 years ago for Mesa. That's what he saw in textbooks. It's inevitable for any textbooks about Islam not to touch upon Israel in a negative way. And the question is whether they look at Judaism in general and Jews in general as enemies of Islam and to be just frowned upon, or they talk about a particular direction, a political move that the Jews supported, and it's Zionism, for example. The distinction really, Islamic textbooks in general draw upon history, because they don't look at Quran and Hadith out of context, out of historical context. Yes, they belong to a certain time, 14 centuries ago. Quran was revealed and the Hadith was there. But from the history of Islam, from the biography of the Prophet, from the dealings with Jews over periods of time, they use that history to justify and legitimize what is happening now to defend themselves against the oppression that they are suffering now. Palestinian issue is one of the main issues raised in every Islamic textbook that in every country. It is raised as a point of contention with the West in general, and Israel in particular. They don't blame Israel as a small entity, but they blame the West that planted Israel in the area, and that's why they are taking issues with the West. And it is raised, and so many negative expressions are used to describe the Jews, but some of them just manipulate history, take history and bring it to the present without contextualizing it. What the Jews did to the Prophet, what they did to Muslim communities in the beginning, how they fought with them, how they rejected Islam, how they were cooperating with the hypocrites, and these all bad things are supported in the Quran. You can easily find a text in the Quran to really prove that, but to transpose that and put it in the modern time, you still have some legitimate reason to do that. When you hear about the killing, you hear about the Palestinians' oppression, you hear about that, you find that there is systematic behavior that's not yet changed. I think this would be the last question, or the last two questions.
I get the idea that when you said that when Turkey became a secularized government, that they were somewhat looked down upon by the rest of the Arab world. And I'm pretty ignorant about this, so I apologize for getting it wrong. But it seems like such a large part of Islam in the Middle East has to do with the imposition of Islam upon the community. And so my question is how feasible is it going to be, for instance, in Iraq right now, to establish a government in which both the Sunnis and the Shiites are able to practice individually without being able to control the way the rest of the country worships?
If I may just express my particular opinion, if we are waiting for a miracle in the 21st century, that would be Iraq. To unify Iraq and put it under a democratic regime that get all these people really work with each other. But as you say, Turkey, yes, looked upon other Arabs as just with no respect because they were ruling them. They were the Ottomans. We were just satellite, not states even, governorates, just belonging to them. But I cannot really address other issues. But Iraq is a very thorny issue. You are living history now to see if the miracle is going to be realized. Yeah, you have the text there. Last question.
Apart from the text, and considering the mess the world is in discussions, have you ever heard anybody raise the idea that Islam really ought to have another prophet to give some guidance to politics and social development? No.
I would really be afraid to ask Brother Hinckley in his sad moments now to help us on that, but we'll see how he did it. But Islam in its doctrine, its tenets, considers itself the last religion, and Prophet Muhammad is the seal of the prophets. So they may accept the idea of reformers. And Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, the founder of the Saudi Wahhabi ideology, was considered a reformer of his time, as referred to as a reformer. But of course, a reformer is the one who works from within the context of Islam to reform with the areas where Islam went wrong and bring it back again to what it's supposed to be. But the idea of a prophet, so many people came in India and Asia and claimed they were prophets and created their own religions. One of them is the Baha'is, and others who claim the same thing. But other Muslims, the majority of Muslims, would not accept that.
Any possibility of a blue ribbon committee among Islamic countries to try to develop ideas of reform that could be acceptable?
I'm very optimistic. We'll wait to that. Yes, there are committees formed in Al-Azhar and other religious organizations to bring people together, at least from a legal point of view. But the idea is there, the aspiration is there. But the problems are much more insurmountable than we think. It could be solved within a small period of time. Thank you very much. We took 10 minutes beyond our time, but it was very wonderful to... I'm sorry that Jim should have been the one to be... He's here all the time. Give him your number so I can ask him about these things. Thank you very much.